Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to give you all a moment just to file in. I want to welcome you to today's webinar to learn about the Preservation League of New York State's Preserve New York Grant Program for 2023. Before we get started, I just want to let you all know that if you have questions along the way, feel free to ask them. You can type them into the Q&A. If you are an architect or a planner seeking continuing education credits today, be sure and send me a chat with your name, your email address, and whether or not you are an architect or a planner so that I can get you what you need for those credits. So I have posted some guidelines in the chat for those of you who may be seeking continuing education credits. Today's webinar is co-sponsored by the American Planning Association, New York State, New York Upstate chapter. The AICP members can earn certification maintenance credits for attending this webinar. More information about the AICP's certificate maintenance program can be found at planning.org/CM. So if you are a planner seeking these credits, please send me a chat with your name and your email address. You need to be in attendance for the duration of the webinar in order to receive your credits. We're also pleased to offer 1.5 continuing ed credits for architects through the New York State Department of Education for participation in this webinar. Certificates of completion will be provided for each architect's individual records and reporting procedures. So let me know if you are an architect in attendance and would like to receive these credits. All planners and architects seeking credits for today, please note your name and email address in the chat and whether you are an architect or a planner. So welcome, everyone. Let's see. Okay, sorry about that. All right, so welcome to today's webinar. We'll be going over grant guidelines, eligibility, project guidelines, application guidelines, and addressing any questions you have about applying to Preserve New York this year. A big thank you to the New York State Council on the Arts and the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, our partners in the Preserve New York Grant Program. If you're not familiar with the Preservation League of New York State and who we are and what we do, we were founded in 1974 by a group of grassroots preservationists who really wanted to see a centralized voice for historic preservation in Albany. We are New York State's statewide nonprofit working for historic preservation. We envision a New York State where our diverse heritage is valued and protected. We empower New Yorkers, all New Yorkers, to use historic preservation to revitalize your communities, protect our heritage, and build a sustainable future. We lead advocacy, economic development, and education programs across the state. Some of our programs include collaboration with our local colleagues. So you may be familiar with your local historic preservation organization like PACNY or PAST or ARCH up in the Adirondacks, Preservation Long Island, Preservation Buffalo Niagara. We like to collaborate with these local colleagues to make sure they're empowered and make sure we know what's going on at a local level and preservation all over the state. We work in public policy at the local, state, and national level to be sure that historic preservation always has a seat at the table and is always part of the conversation when it comes to sustainable economic development and smart community revitalization. We provide technical services. This is through resources on our website. You can call us, you can email us, and we also give workshops on various historic preservation topics. So if you have a question about historic preservation, we're always here to answer. We provide referrals and advice as well. So if we can't help you, we usually know who can and can steer you in the right direction. We give grants, and that's what we're here to talk about today. We also give awards for preservation excellence. So if you know of a project or a person or an organization who's doing great work in preservation, let us know, nominate them for an award. Our preservation book club meets every month, and we read some fascinating books and discuss them. We have authors come in to do author talks. It's a lot of fun. It's free. It's available on our website, so please sign up. Finally, our Zabar Scholarship Program awards $2,500 to a student who is studying historic preservation or a related field in New York State. So please spread the word about our Save Our Scholarship program. So we're here to talk about grants today. Our grants are a partnership with the New York State Council on the Arts, with additional support from the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation and the Hudson River Valley National Heritage Area for projects occurring in that area. So we're very grateful for this additional support and for our NYSCA partnership that allows us to fund historic preservation initiatives all over the state. We'll begin by talking about our Technical Assistance Grant Program. So TAG grants are the smaller of our two grant programs meant to fund specific historic preservation projects. So we'll talk about what that means in just a moment. TAG is funded by NYSCA with support from the Gardner Foundation and the Hudson River Valley National Heritage Area for projects occurring in those areas. Our grants are open to 501c3 nonprofits and municipalities. By municipalities, I mean units of local government, so village, town, county governments. The applicant must own the building or the resource that is the subject of the grant, or have a long-term lease. A long-term lease for the purposes of this grant program is at least 6 years remaining in your lease at the time of application. Please keep in mind that if you are leasing your property, the owner cannot be a private owner, it cannot be a state-owned property, and it cannot be owned by anything other than a 501c3 or a municipality. So we only fund those groups. I can answer why if you want to know why, but it has a lot to do with site control, making sure that we are enabling public access to the resource. It's important to remember that the funding for our grants come from the New York State Council on the Arts. And so for the Technical Assistance Grants Program, your building must also have an arts or a cultural purpose. So your organization needs to either be an arts organization, performing arts, a history museum, or have significant arts or cultural programming under your umbrella. Or you need to have partnerships with groups that use your building for arts and cultural programming. Technical assistance grants top out at $4,000 for a $5,000 project. So what this means is that you are required to provide a 20% cash match of the project cost. For purposes of our grants, project refers to only the funded project. We're talking about the preservation planning project and not the capital project. So keep in mind, when we talk about the project, we don't mean capital work to follow, we mean just the preservation planning project that we're funding. Our technical assistance grants come around in late summer with an October deadline, so something to look forward to later in the year. TAG grants fund the projects that are listed here on your screen. Technical assistance grants are meant to be somewhat flexible with regard to the kinds of projects that we fund. So this is a framework. If you have an idea for a project that you think would fall within this framework, feel free to reach out to me and talk about it because we have a little bit of flexibility in that regard. But some of the projects that we fund are accessibility studies. So these are handicap accessibility studies or any way that makes your building more accessible to the public. So if you're wondering how to add an elevator to your building, if it can be done, the feasibility of it, what it might cost, what it might entail, then an accessibility study would help you sort all that out. All of these projects bring in a historic preservation professional, usually an architect or an engineer, to assess the issue with your building and give you expert advice for how to remediate it. They will provide you a report that gives suggested recommendations for repairs and provides you a roadmap forward for the repairs of your building. So I have a question. Let's pause for a question. For TAG, is it related? Is it building related or also include preservation? That is a great question, and we get this all the time, mostly because of this word conservation that's on the screen. We do not fund collections related preservation. We don't fund collections at all. There is a NYSCA re-grant organization that does that. They are the Greater Hudson Heritage Network. So if you have collections related preservation issues, then turn to them because they have special grant programs just for you. So I'm glad you asked, Martha. Thank you for that question. So speaking of conservation, let's just hit on this one bullet point here, specialized conservation study. So what does that mean? Technical assistance grants would fund a specialized conservation study. And that means conservation of a specific kind of building material or a specific issue with your building. So I have some examples. So one specialized conservation study that we funded in the past was an acoustics study. There was an old chapel. A performing arts groups wanted to use the old church as a performing arts space, but the acoustics were terrible and they needed to know how to cut down on the echoey nature of that building without compromising the historic appearance of the interior. So the whole point of our grants is to make sure that you can preserve the historic integrity of your building while making that building function the way you need it to. So they needed to know how they could improve the acoustics without putting up a bunch of ugly panels all over their walls and ceiling, in a nutshell. So we funded that study for them. Another specialized conservation study example is the conservation of historic stencils. So a historic house museum had beautiful historic hand-painted stencils on the walls and ceiling, and they were starting to fade and peel and crack, and they weren't sure what to do about it and who to ask. So this brought in a specialist to look at those things and provide to them recommendations for remediation. Paint analysis, historic paint analysis falls under the umbrella of specialized conservation study. So, and I'll probably think of another one pretty soon, but anyway, odd things like that require a specialist to look at it and help guide you on the conservation of that aspect of your building. A feasibility reuse study is ideal if you're looking at adaptive reuse of a building or a section of a building or a room. We fund those through TAG engineering structural analyses. So if you notice that one wall is bowing out, or in the, actually, speaking of historic stencils, there was one organization that their stencils were cracking, but really it was the plaster that was cracking, and they needed to know why. So they needed to conserve their stencils, but most importantly, they needed to find out why on earth the wall was cracking in the first place. That required an engineering structural analysis. And that organization got a TAG grant for an engineering structural analysis to figure out what was going on with that stenciled wall. And then they can come back later and get a TAG grant for a specialized conservation study to address these stencils themselves. So there's an example of how our technical assistance grants can work with one another to help you toward a solution that is a little more complex than it appears. And finally, the mechanical, electrical, and plumbing analysis. This is to upgrade your building if you need to add an upgraded HVAC system, or you want central air conditioning, or you want to install fire suppression, but you're not really sure how to go about that without ripping through historic walls and plaster. If you want to put solar panels on your roof and you want to make sure that you're doing it in a way that preserves the historic integrity of your building, this would bring in a preservation architect or other professional to help you figure out how this can be done. They also, usually with these studies, you get a best guess cost estimates as well, and specific steps for how to take care of these particular issues. So this can really provide the confidence that your organization needs to tackle some of these specific building issues. I think I have another question. Would an existing conditions report from an architect or for a barn be covered? That's a really great question, Nina, and unfortunately we cannot fund work that's already been done. That said, if you're phasing a project and let's say you're looking to do a historic structure report, and we'll talk about those later under Preserve New York, but historic structure reports are extensive, they're expensive, and they can be phased. We can fund various phases of a project, but if it has already begun, that becomes a tough sell, and we cannot fund retroactively. So if you've already had one done, great. Sorry, we can't help you with that. So I hope that answers your question. All right, any questions about the projects that we fund through TAG? Oh, an existing condition. I'm sorry, Nina, I misread that. Existing conditions report is another word for a conditions report. For a barn used for housing visiting artists. Yes, yes, sorry. Yes, that would be permissible under Preserve New York. All right. Technical assistance grants. Last year, we gave 19 awards across 14 counties of New York State for a little over $68,000 in grant money. There we go. All right. So if you have any questions about technical assistance grants, they come around in the fall with an October deadline. And they are the smaller of our two grant programs meant to address specific issues with your building. Now we'll talk about Preserve New York grants. We are in the midst of Preserve New York season. And this is the larger of our two grant programs. This comes around after the first of the year. And this year has a March 31st deadline. And don't worry, I'll repeat that later. March 31st is the deadline for this year. We are in our 30th year of Preserve New York grants. We're extremely proud of our grant programs. Very grateful to NYSCA for funding them all these years. We have additional support from the Gardner Foundation for Preserve New York for nonprofit projects occurring on Long Island. These grants are also open to 501c3 nonprofits and units of local government. The applicant needs to own the building or have a long-term lease, at least 6 years remaining in your lease when you apply. We fund 4 very specific project types through Preserve New York, and we will talk about each one of those with examples. The maximum grant award is about $20,000. There is no hard and fast ceiling to Preserve New York, but keep in mind that if you have an outrageous ask, it makes it a little bit less competitive. So make sure that when you are working with your consultant, that you're getting a reasonably priced budget so that we can fund it. Let me check for questions real quick. Excellent. Okay. All right. There is a required 20% cash match with Preserve New York too. So keep in mind that even though PNY grants are larger, so is your cash match. Preserve New York grants are meant to fund preservation planning projects that precede major capital projects, major renovations, restorations, major repairs, phased projects. These are comprehensive for your building rather than like TAG, looking at one specific issue at a time. These are comprehensive looks at your whole building and provide you a prioritized list of remediation for your building. And those are for the condition reports. So let's move on and talk about the 4 project types that we fund through Preserve New York. Oh, I'm sorry. I have a question. It says the chat is disabled. Oh boy, I have no idea why that might be. I don't know if that is, there we go. That was my fault. I hope that you all can see the chat now. I'm going to post once again the guidelines for continuing education credits in the chat. There. All right, let me know if there's any other problems with the chat. And thank you for bringing that to my attention, Andrea. All right, so listing your information here as a planner. Oh, Elizabeth, thank you for asking. If you are looking to get CM credits, please put them in the chat. You should be able to do it now. Your name, your email address, and what kinds of credits you're looking for. You can send a private chat to me if you wish. All right. So the 4 project types that we fund through Preserve New York are historic structure reports, cultural or historic landscape reports, condition reports, and cultural resource surveys. Condition reports, we used to call those building condition reports, but we have funded condition reports for fences, cemeteries, all kinds of things, bridges. So we hesitate to call them just building condition reports anymore. So these are existing condition assessments of a building or historic resource. Last year, we made 22 awards. That's out of 48 applications we received for Preserve New York. So your odds aren't too bad in any given year to get funded. This is it's a competitive grant program, and it really depends on the number of applications we receive and how much money we have to give. But last year we gave almost $236,000 for Preserve New York. So if you're thinking about applying for a Preserve New York grant, I urge you to think about where your Preserve New York grant funded report would fall within the realm of your capital project. So here are some tasks involved in a major capital project. The first 2 points, the condition assessment and the preservation planning study, are what is funded through Preserve New York. So they tend to be the very first steps in any capital project. When you're looking at your building, saying something needs to be done here, we have lots of repairs, where do we begin? Where do we start? What needs to happen? Who do we hire? How do we find the right people to work on our building? That sort of thing. Those questions are often answered in your historic structure report, condition report, historic landscape report. So that is what Preserve New York is intended to fund. Everything beyond that, bid documents, architectural drawings, plans, those things come later. We do not fund those things. We don't fund bricks and mortar. We do not fund construction documents, things like that. All right, so there's a fine line between a preservation planning study and all those documents that come later. So if you have questions about that, please let me know. Oh, Debbie, thank you for asking. Actually, I did not introduce myself. So my name is Jana Rudler. I'm the Grants and Technical Services Manager for the Preservation League of New York State. Thank you for asking. I think I jumped right into the program without doing that. So thanks for the reminder. And I will have contact information at the end of this webinar in case you want to get in touch with any questions. So make sure that your organization is prepared to handle all the steps in this process before you apply for Preserve New York, or at least make sure that you're aware of these steps. A Preserve New York grant can jumpstart a major capital project. Preserve New York grants can also help leverage capital grants later, and we will have some fantastic examples of that in just a little while. But there are lots of reasons to get a Preserve New York grant to start your project. Having a historic preservation professional, architect, or engineer, or team of the two look at your building before work begins is invaluable. This is a vote of confidence to any potential funders for your project. They see that you have this study in hand, you know what needs to happen with your building, and you're ready to commence work. So a Preserve New York grant can be very valuable to getting your project off the ground. So a few more things to think about before you apply for a Preserve New York grant. Think about how this potential project fits your mission. It may seem obvious to you, you carry out your mission in your historic building, but make sure that you can articulate that in a grant application. You're going to need to, not just for us, but for any capital money that you pursue or any fundraising that you do at all, you need to talk about your mission. Get people excited about your organization, get them excited about your project, and get them to love your building. Make sure that people understand how important that the resource is to your organization and your mission. Be sure that your board of directors is fully on board with the project. Make sure that they understand that fundraising is going to be a major component of this project. Grants alone aren't going to cover your project costs. So make sure that they understand that there's going to be some pretty significant fundraising that needs to take place. Be sure they're ready to go with that. Be sure they understand what the Preserve New York grant does fund, what it doesn't fund, and what needs to come thereafter. And finally, commit to hiring qualified building professionals. That may seem like a no-brainer, but it's easier said than done. There are a lot of well-meaning people, board members who have that cousin who's a carpenter and can do some work on your building for cheap. It's tempting, but make sure that you hire qualified building professionals. Your consultant who does your preservation planning study can help connect you with those building professionals, can help you understand what to look for when you're hiring a contractor. Their documents that they provide to you, your condition assessment, can help you guide your contractor, can help you understand what needs to happen to your building and what they need to be careful about. So make sure that you're hiring qualified building professionals. It's not easy. All right, so let's talk about the 4 kinds of projects that we fund through Preserve New York. The first is historic structure report. So what is a historic structure report? It's a comprehensive condition assessment of your building, plus research about the building's architectural and social history. So who lived there? What did they do? Were they famous? How many times did the building change hands? Was there a wing built onto your building later? Was there a wing demolished of your building? Did the roof line change over time? Did the windows change? Did the entrance doors change? Things like that. The progression of construction of your building over the years. This is particularly useful if you're planning a major restoration project, if you're looking to restore the building to a former appearance. This is also useful if you have major renovation planned and you want to make sure that you understand how that building was built and put together in phases, if it was built in phases. This is useful also for buildings that are interpreted to the public so that you can talk about the history of the building and the people who lived there and worked there. If it was built by an architect of note, then you'll find out and you'll be able to include that in your interpretation as well. We have funded historic structure reports for museums, for other buildings as well. Oftentimes it helps if you're looking to include a more diverse story in your building. You want to tell the complete story of your building. There was one organization that embarked on a historic structure report because they wanted to start telling the stories of the servants that lived in the buildings. Nowadays, of course we would, right? Why wouldn't we want to tell those stories? But this was some years ago, and they wanted to include those stories, but they weren't really aware of them. What spaces of the house were really actually inhabited by servants? Did the servants ever live there at all? Things like that. The historic structure report helped them with that, helped them improve the visitor experience, traffic flow through the building for tours, and also helped them get a complete look at the repairs and renovations that needed to take place. If you're looking to have a long-term maintenance plan for your building, a condition report or a historic structure report can help with that. All right. Oh, on your screen, you see the Rare Center for Immigrant Culture and History. They received a Preserve New York grant in 2021 for a historic structure report. This museum is in Kingston, New York. If you have a chance to visit, please do. They're doing amazing work there. This was formerly the Rare Bakery for a good many years. And currently they're working on rehabbing the upper floors of this building to create interpretive spaces. So they received a grant from us for a historic structure report. And this helped guide major rehabilitation efforts within the building. An annex was built off the back, or is being built off the back as a result of their historic structure report. And they came to us in 2022 for a TAG grant for a hazmat remediation study, because as they're rehabbing those upper floors, they're encountering lead paint, mold, and asbestos. And they need to know how best to handle those things as they're trying to turn those into public spaces. So it's a fascinating place. Their project, gosh, they've been working on this building for at least 10 years with the same consultant. Marilyn Kaplan has been working with them. She's great. And our Preserve New York funded historic structure report and TAG grants have helped show them the way forward and help them plan long-term for this building. And it's really coming along. Oh, something else I wanted to mention. I can't believe I forgot. So not only did they receive grants from us to help guide efforts with their building, congratulations to the Rare Center for receiving an EPF grant, Environmental Protection Fund grant in 2022 of $469,000 for rehab efforts in this building. So I mentioned earlier that Preserve New York grants can help leverage larger grants later for capital work, and this is a perfect example of that. So undoubtedly, having a historic structure report And having a hazmat remediation study done helped them leverage the funds they need to perform the work that was recommended in those reports. I have a question. Does the Preservation League have statistics on the number of properties that received planning grants that have successfully gone on to implement construction rehabilitation? That is a fabulous question. So the Preservation League did a number of studies over the years to see the outcomes. We call them outcome studies of our grant funded projects. We did one for TAG a number of years ago. I think it was 2012. So it's been 11 years ago now. These studies we do more or less annually on a more informal basis for our own information. But as far as public studies, we've only got a couple of them. The last one done in 2012 for TAG. What we have started doing is looking at the Environmental Protection Fund grants, the REDC grants that are announced at the end of the year from the state, and looking through that list and seeing who previously had gotten grants from us. And we did a study in 2022, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. I have a whole slide on it and some examples, but it is exciting to see what happens with these projects. Sometimes we never know. Folks will get a grant from us and we never hear from them again. In that case, we call them up and ask how things are going. But we really, we like to know what happens with these projects. Sometimes we find out and sometimes we don't. I guess that's a short answer for that. All right, so we're having some more problems with the chat. I'm not exactly sure why. There's a drop down in your chat. Make sure that says everyone. If you want to send a chat, it should be working now. So I apologize for those problems. Let's see. All right, if the chat's not working, feel free to put any questions in the Q&A. I apologize. I'm not sure what's going on with the chat. It looks okay from my end, but it's one of those things. Sorry. All right, let's move on. Okay, so an example of a historic structure report that's a little bit different that we funded last year was for the Friends of Camp Little Notch in the Adirondacks. Mount Hope Furnace is an enormous chimney in the middle of the wilderness. This used to be a Girl Scout camp, and some years ago, not too long ago actually, some former Girl Scouts got together and they purchased this property to preserve it. And this furnace is part of the property. They want to make sure that it's stable, that it's being well preserved. It's got a fascinating history and a connection with the Underground Railroad. So if you see the picture on the left shows a little stone bench. On the back of that bench, and it's really hard to see in the picture, but the sign depicts some hieroglyphs that are carved into the back of that bench. And the furnace chimney, this furnace chimney is one of them. And it was believed to be a map of sorts, markers to look for along the path to freedom. So kind of an amazing history that this furnace has. So with a historic structure report, they can make sure that it is stable, well preserved, and well represented in the history of the camp. And finally, last example I have for you for historic structure reports, Village of Lakewood out in Chautauqua County got a historic structure report for their village hall last year. Their intent is to rehabilitate the interior spaces, to improve utility and traffic flow. And they also want to restore the building to its historic appearance. So this had been a fire hall at one time, and you can see two bays on the front of the building where there had been fire engine bays. They want to restore the appearance of those historic doors, and they want to move their main entrance off to the side. And historically, the main entrance was off to the side with a little portico above it. They want to restore that so that this building will have its historic appearance. And this will also enable them to install an elevator inside, so moving around some spaces interiorly. They have their village museums in the basement. Of course, where else would the village museum be? They want to bring it up out of the basement and improve accessibility and visibility for that museum. So good for them. I'm glad they're doing this. This is all wonderful work. It's a great project. And their historic structure report is what begins this project for them. So congratulations to Lakewood. I love seeing what they're doing. All right, so condition reports. So these were formerly known as building condition reports. They can be the condition report for any historic resource within reason. Like I've mentioned, we have funded condition reports for bridges, for cemeteries, for all sorts of structures, for ruins. We'll talk about that a little bit too. This is a comprehensive condition assessment of a structure. So this is a top to bottom, inside and out condition assessment of your building. If you want to know what your building needs for long-term maintenance, what repairs, prioritized list of repairs, you need a condition report. This can be tailored to meet your building's needs. So if there are some aspects of the building that concern you more than others, your consultant can focus on those things. This can also include some feasibility. So if you want to change the way that you're using your space in the building, then some feasibility analysis can figure into a condition report. This is usually completed by an architect. And we do provide a list of qualified consultants. You don't have to choose from our list, but they are people who have successfully completed our grant-funded projects in the past. So we will provide that to you if you need any help finding a consultant for your project. And I urge all of you to talk to a couple consultants, make sure that you're hiring the ones that are the most suited to your project in particular. Take a look at their portfolio, make sure that they have the kind of experience that they need to provide an assessment of your building. So last year, we provided a Preserve New York grant to Gowanda's Historic Hollywood Theater. You can see the theater in the photo all the way to the left. The building in the foreground is a bank building next door to their theater. They purchased this building to provide support space for their historic theater. If you've never seen the inside of the Gowanda Historic Hollywood Theater, I urge you to go and see it. It's kind of out there in Cattaraugus County, so if you can't go in person, at least look online. It's amazing what they have done with this space. We have funded the theater through our Preserve New York and TAG grant programs in the past. A couple of years ago, they got a TAG grant for an accessibility study for this bank building. And they were so proud to show us when we went to visit that they had already implemented their accessibility recommendations and built an accessible entrance on the side of the bank building. In their words, they started this project with accessibility in mind. So we really like to see that. They wanted to make sure, first and foremost, that this space was going to be fully accessible to everyone. The interior of this bank building needs to be rehabbed and changed somewhat while preserving the historic integrity of it. So their condition report will help them do that. Cultural landscape reports. Cultural landscape reports are also known as historic landscape reports. Sometimes we use that term interchangeably, but it really depends on the project. This is similar to a historic structure report, but specific to a landscape. This includes a conditions analysis of the landscape, a description of its historic significance and development over time, and is usually completed by a landscape architect. We have funded historic and cultural landscape reports for a number of organizations like the Seward House Museum, museums that are looking to restore their historic gardens, find cultural landscape reports to be particularly helpful. If you want to remediate some drainage issues around your historic building, but you don't really want to mess with the historic landscape and you don't want to negatively impact that, then a cultural landscape report can help you do that as well. I do have a question. Let's see, let's pause for a question. Is it possible that a historic structure is too far gone to make it worthwhile to restore it? Wow, that's a big ball of wax, Martha, but you know what? I've had that question before. I have some great examples of buildings that you would not believe were savable that have been saved. So I would say almost never. You know, almost never is a historic structure too far gone to restore it or to save it. I'm sure there are exceptions to that, but I've seen some buildings. One of the examples that I'm thinking of is the Palmer Opera House in Cuba, New York. Again, way out there in, I think, Allegheny County. But if you have a chance to stop in, that place, the entire ceiling had collapsed, the entire roof had collapsed. It was a shell, and they brought it back, and it's magnificent. You would be surprised at what's savable. Worthwhile? You know, is it worthwhile? That's a good question. That depends on your organization, depends on your goals. It's probably worthwhile to somebody to save the building. But I love that question, and thank you for asking. I hope I've encouraged you. I hope I haven't sent you down a bad road. But I mean, honestly, it's almost always worthwhile. If you talk to people who have saved structures that were considered unsalvageable, they're glad they did it. I've never heard anybody say they regretted it. So let's look at some examples of cultural landscape reports. So in 2019, we funded a cultural landscape report for the village of Owego. They have their Evergreen Cemetery. If you've never been there, you should visit. It's awesome. Tioga County, New York, right on the Pennsylvania line. This cemetery is an example of the rural cemetery movement when burial grounds moved away from the center of town around churches out to areas where they could serve as parks and as places of respite for people. And of course, obviously a place of rest. This cemetery is built on a terraced hill. And back a few years ago, when we had some unprecedented rainfall, they had some drainage issues. They had some erosion issues in the cemetery. They needed to make sure that that would never happen again through some improvements, but they wanted to make sure that they were preserving historic walkways and plantings and monuments in the cemetery. So $8,000 later, they have their cultural landscape report that helped guide some work. The picture on the right-hand side, you can see that work has already begun there, so that the next time we have unprecedented rainfall, hopefully it won't ruin the cemetery this time. So it's wonderful to see a village taking such good care of their cemetery. Now, I want to mention cemeteries because we rarely fund cemeteries. The reason for this, we only fund cemeteries if they're owned by a municipality or a 501c3 nonprofit. Most cemeteries are owned by a cemetery association that is not a 501c3 specifically. So that prevents us from funding those. We will fund cemeteries if they have significant programs. The Village of Owego and the Tioga County Historical Society sponsor walking tours, historic tours, and programs in the cemetery, and publications as well. So they have an impressive array of cultural programming in and around their cemetery. This is why we funded it. So we won't fund every cemetery. We wish we could. I really wish we could, but we can't. So if your cemetery is owned by a 501c3 nonprofit or municipality and has historical, cultural, artistic programming within it, then reach out. All right, I have a question. Can the cultural landscape report be used to find underground items like septic systems and old fountains? Wow, that's a great question. I would say yes. Our cultural landscape reports that I have seen have identified features that were not visible necessarily to all of us on the surface of the land. Landscape architects, historic landscape architects are trained to look for these kinds of features. We don't fund archaeology. So if that's what you're getting at, I apologize. We don't fund archaeology or GPR, ground penetrating radar, but a good cultural resource report would go a long way toward identifying these old systems that you're referring to. And if you're not sure about this, talk to your, ask your consultant, ask your landscape architect if it's possible for them to identify those features. But I have seen features like that identified in cultural landscape reports. Thanks for that question. All right. Cultural resource surveys. This is the fourth project type that we fund through Preserve New York. They're a little different. So cultural resource surveys are not focused on any one specific building or resource. They're an inventory of historic resources in an area. So this can be a neighborhood or an area. We've funded surveys of burial grounds and cemeteries in a certain radius. Almost always, these are leading to the establishment of a state and national register listed historic district. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means later. But these surveys can be sponsored by a nonprofit, so you don't have to own the building to apply, but you do have to have some sort of relationship to this, to the survey, to the project. We have funded museums and municipalities both for cultural resource surveys, as well as community development groups. You do have to be a 501c3 nonprofit or municipality to apply, but you don't have to own the building because there's lots. All right. An example from last year, this Philmont Beautification is doing amazing things in the village of Philmont, New York. They got a Preserve New York grant in 2022 for their State National Historic District nomination. We had funded them previously for a cultural resource survey in their village, and that survey led to enough resources being identified to justify historic district nomination. This year, in 2022, late 2022, they received an $800,000 Restore New York grant to restore the old hotel that you see in the center of your screen. This was a grant to the private owner of the hotel. So we don't fund private owners, but sometimes the state will. So this Restore New York grant went toward restoring 56 Main Street, also known as the Hopkins House. They had a lot of help from Philmont Beautification Incorporated in applying for this grant. The village of Philmont actually submitted the grant. It was a team effort, truly a team effort. They have a preservation specialist, development specialists, tax credit specialists involved in this effort. So Philmont Beautification is engaging in community revitalization through a number of avenues. Their historic district nomination is a key part of that. This will give business owners and historic property owners within that district access to historic tax credits to help make rehabilitations and repairs of their historic buildings more affordable. This is one big reason that municipalities go for historic district nominations. Philmont Beautification, as I mentioned, has received a number of grants from us over the years. Actually, a 2019 Preserve New York grant for the first of their cultural resource surveys, and then that led to the 2022 grant for the nomination. So congratulations to Philmont Beautification. They are doing amazing things in their village, and we are so happy to be part of that story. Let's pause for a couple questions. What if a historic cemetery has a 501c3 foundation? It's a great question. I hear from a lot of cemetery friends groups that are 501c3s that were established to fundraise for the cemetery. Unfortunately, we cannot fund them unless they're the owner of the cemetery, or unless they have a long-term lease and the owner is also either a municipality or 501c3 nonprofit. The reason for this is that cemetery associations are 501c 14s, I think, something like that. They're established specifically for the benefit of their members only, for the benefit of the people who own plots within the cemetery and their families. Not that they would, but they could close the gates and bar public entry if they wanted to that cemetery. The intent of our grants is to increase public access to the arts. I say that because we are a New York State Council on the Arts re-grantor, and that is their mission. Our mission is historic preservation. So we are helping to ensure public access to the arts and culture through historic preservation with our grants. We can't fund private clubs, fraternal organizations, or cemetery associations for that reason. And I apologize. It seems incredibly unfair, and I wish I had a better answer for you. 501c3 foundations that are formed to fundraise for cemeteries can do private fundraising and offer that the tax incentives that it's intended to, but unfortunately they don't qualify by themselves for historic preservation grants. So I'm sorry. Another question, does a historic district designation require physical contiguous structures? I don't think so. Shoot, I almost said no. I know we have funded surveys of non-contiguous resources. And I believe that they can form a historic district. So I guess my question is, or my answer is, it does not require physical contiguous structures. Part of the reason I say that is that in any given historic district, you can have contributing buildings and non-contributing buildings. You can have a historic district that's got all these historic buildings and then, oops, a 1980s gas station. And then more, so they don't have to be contiguous. They can have non-contributing structures, parking lots, things like that within them. All right, so good question, Kathy. You almost caught me with that one. All right, so Philmont beautification was our, all right. So oftentimes I mentioned that Philmont Beautification Incorporated has gotten a couple different grants from us for surveys. Cultural resource surveys are often done in phases, with the ultimate goal sometimes being a historic district nomination. So oftentimes we will fund the intensive and reconnaissance level first, and then they'll come back to us later for a grant to do the historic district nomination. That's why oftentimes people get repeated Preserve New York grants for cultural resource surveys. I wanted to mention too, if a municipality is looking to designate a local district at the local level, a survey can help them do that too. Cultural resource surveys can serve a number of purposes besides national and state register historic district nominations. We have funded cultural resource surveys that recognize the work of a particular architect. And those were non-contiguous structures. Now, I don't know if they comprised a district eventually, but the intent was to identify the structures in the city that were designed by one particular architect. Those structures were being demolished. And so they wanted to do a survey of those structures while they were still standing so they could better protect them from demolition. These were mid-century structures, so often unappreciated. And so that survey was of the work of a particular architect within a city. We have also funded surveys that were intended to do an inventory of historic resources for the purposes of planning at the local level, disaster resistance planning. If you've had a flood in your village or town and you found yourself scrambling to get FEMA aid, if you have an inventory of historic resources already in place and you have identified those historic resources that are important in your community, that are valued and need extra protection, then that can give you a leg up when disaster strikes. And when FEMA comes in and says, how do you need us to help? You have a document that says these structures, these are the ones that are vulnerable in our community. These are the ones that are important. So these surveys can serve local planning purposes, National Register purposes, and recognition of architectural styles and architects, among other things. So what does it mean to be in a National Register Historic District? Well, that's a good question. It's not the same as being in a local district, I can tell you that. So we get a lot of questions. If my building is listed on the National Register, can I still paint it any color I want? Yes, you can. This is not to denigrate local districts. They exist for a reason. They exist to preserve the local character and flavor of your neighborhood. You buy a cute little house, you love the neighborhood, you want it preserved. Local district that falls under local jurisdiction can help regulate the appearance of that neighborhood. That's a local district. It's important to local character and local identity. If your neighborhood is listed on the State and National Register of Historic Places, what that means is that that neighborhood has some sort of architectural, historic, or cultural significance at the state or national level, sometimes at the local level. This is coordinated in New York State through the Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation, and at the national level through the National Park Service. Our state and national registers work hand in hand. So oftentimes I'll just say National Register, but I really mean both, because you get listed state and then the National Register listing follows almost always. So you can have individual buildings listed on the National Register or entire districts. What this does is it opens the door to financial incentives for historic preservation. Being listed on the National Register of Historic Places does not place restrictions on your building. You can paint it any color you want. You can build onto it. You can change its appearance. You can tear it down. But if you decide to pursue historic tax credits, which is a financial incentive for maintaining your building, then some of those controls kick in. Say you want to change the appearance of your building, you want to use historic tax credits to help you pay for it, then the State Historic Preservation Office would need to review the plans that you have for your work to make sure that they adhere to the Secretary of the Interior standards for historic preservation. The whole intent here is that tax money, tax incentives are going to you to help you maintain your historic property, help you maintain its appearance, help you keep it in good repair, and help keep it livable for you. The flip side to that is that it has a public benefit. So when I walk through your historic neighborhood, I see all these beautifully maintained historic houses. You used some tax money to help maintain those houses, but it provides a public benefit to me. I get to appreciate them. And, it adds, we could talk all day about adding to the quality of life in an area that a well-maintained historic district does. But mostly what you need to know is that being listed on the State National Register of Historic Places does not place restrictions on you or what you can do to your property. It's all carrot and no stick. You get access to tax incentives. If you are a 501c3 nonprofit or municipality, it opens the door to grant opportunities. So all good stuff. All right, let's pause for questions. How are we doing for time? Oh yeah, it's getting to be about 1 o'clock. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. We have a question from Nina. Can a CLG, a Certified Local Government Preservation Commission, apply for a grant for a National Register nomination for a property we do not own, but it is one of our locally designated landmarks? That's a great question. So we're talking here about an individual nomination rather than a district nomination. Unfortunately, we don't fund individual nominations. I'm sorry. I hate to say no to that. We do fund district nominations, just not individual ones. Sorry. Another question from Jenny. What specific grant opportunities are available for nonprofits in historic districts? Well, generally speaking, any grants that require that your building be placed on the National Register. So we're talking about state grants, Environmental Protection Fund grants. These are through the Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. You can check out their grant opportunities. I don't think I have a link to them in my slideshow, but if you want links to that, I can give that to you later. Yeah, mostly state grants. Also, grants through the national grants. So federal grants through the National Trust for Historic Preservation, they generally require that your structure be on the National Register and that its significance is on the national level, so that your structure has national significance. It doesn't have to be a national historical landmark necessarily, but its level of significance needs to be national. So those are his National Trust for Historic Preservation grants. They do require that. Those are a couple examples. Our grants do not require that your building be on the National Register of Historic Places. Okay. All right. So last year, so in late 2021, the governor announced the regional economic development grants for that year. We did a little study internally looking to see how many of those grantees had previously enjoyed support from the Preservation League of New York State. And what we found was that for every $13 that they received from the state through grants, we gave $1. So we had given $1 to them in Preservation League grants. They received $13 in state grants. In other words, our grants help leverage big grant money. So that was last year. So we have looked at the list this year. I don't have a slide for it yet, but I do have some examples. So from last year, I include this because it's one of my favorite stories ever. Ten Brook Mansion owned by the Albany County Historical Association, got a series of grants from the Preservation League of New York State over the years, starting with a building condition survey in 2015. That was a TAG grant. Historic structure report in 2018 that helped them reimagine the interior spaces of their museum for interpretive purposes, being able to tell a more complete story about the people who lived and worked in that house over the years. Their historic structure report identifies some drainage issues around the house in the ground. And their consultant said, you know, this house sits on what used to be a pretty active historic property with outbuildings and a barn and driveways and gardens and all this stuff. Why don't you get a cultural landscape report to help sort this all out and include all that in your interpretation and be able to remediate the drainage problem? So that's exactly what they did in 2020. They came to us for a Preserve New York grant yet again. We funded their cultural landscape report. And while the consultant was completing that, she found evidence of the old carriage barn that had sat out back of the mansion. And you can see a picture of the falling down carriage barn. It had been demolished by the city previously. And their landscape architect said, you know, you should probably think about rebuilding that carriage barn and using it as a visitor center. They had plans, big plans for this museum. Their visitors were having a hard time finding a place to park, having a hard time finding out where to get tickets for their tours. They were kind of stumbling through the gardens. They didn't want to look at anything. They just wanted to get in the house. It was they needed to improve their visitor experience, in other words. So as part of an overall plan to reimagine the site, to interpret the historic site as it once appeared, they took the advice from the recommendations from their cultural landscape report, and they pursued a feasibility and reuse study through a TAG grant to see how feasible exactly it would be to use the existing foundations and thresholds that were still on the ground from their carriage barn to build a new one, to reconstruct the historic carriage barn and use it as an ADA accessible visitor center and as a point of entry between a new parking lot and their mansion. It's an amazing project. It's going to improve the visitor experience from the time they park their cars until they get into the house and take their tour. I'm really excited about this project, as if you can't tell. Well, the state was excited about it too, because in 2021, they received a Regional Economic Development Council grant of $283,000 and some odd dollars to start this project, to start the stabilization and accessibility project, which includes the carriage barn, better parking, better walkways, and fully interpreted historic gardens. It's going to be amazing. I can't wait. All right, so this year, Old Westbury Gardens, we love them. What a beautiful place. Let's see, 2021, we funded a condition study through TAG of their thatched cottage, an adorable little cottage that they use for their arts programming. It has a thatched roof. Talk about specialized conservation study, right? They needed to know how to maintain that thatched roof. So they got a TAG grant to help them with that. Previously, they had gotten a Preserve New York grant in 2007 for a historical landscape report. You can see they have quite the historic landscape there, and a condition report in 2017. They were able to leverage $200,000 in Environmental Protection Fund money for the restoration of their boxwood garden. So pretty exciting stuff at Old Westbury Gardens. We cannot wait. They want to reinstall some historic features of their historic garden. So I can't wait to see how that turns out. Congratulations to them. Sylvester Manor Educational Farm, they have only owned the site for about 10 years. It is an incredibly intact early farmstead on Shelter Island, just off the tip of Long Island. They've come to us for grants over the years. We're really excited to see that most recently, we funded a TAG grant for a condition study of their barn, so that they can move some of their weather-dependent programming indoors. They host school groups there. If it's raining, it's a bummer for everybody, but if they could use this barn for programming space, it would help a lot. So our TAG grant will help them figure that out. But they have leveraged their Preserve New York and TAG grants to the tune of $500,000 from the Environmental Protection Fund for the Manor House restoration. And this is something they've been working on through Historic Structure Report years ago. So congratulations to them. Things are really happening at Sylvester Manor. Cannot wait to see how this turns out. So if you want to read more about how you can leverage our grants for bigger money on down the road, we have our study from last year up on our website. You can check that out. One from this year will be forthcoming. We're still combing through the grantees and figuring that all out, but we're so happy to see how many people are getting those EPF grants for historic preservation for their buildings, especially when they have the guidance of a Preserve New York grant in their pocket. So congratulations to those grantees. There's many more than what I pointed out here, but I do not have time to go over all of them. So I hope you are all excited about applying for Preserve New York this year. It's an easy process. So start by reading the guidelines. The guidelines will cover things that I didn't necessarily cover here, such as what we fund and what we don't fund. I tried to go over that, but it spells it out. You can print out our guidelines, share them with your consultant, share them with your board, make sure that everybody understands what a Preserve New York grant is, what it funds, and what it doesn't fund. Then fill out the pre-application. It's available on our website. It's short. It's like an LOI. It just helps us to become familiar with your organization, your ideas for your project. It helps me establish your eligibility to apply for the grant. Once I go through your pre-application, if everything checks out, I will send you a link to the full application. It's an entirely online process through a platform called Smarter Select. You'd be required to create an account, and then you would have access to the entire application. You can preview the application, you can print it out if you want, but you do have to submit it entirely online. But talk to your consultant, make sure that you're talking early with a consultant. They get booked up, they get really busy during PNY season and tag season. So I will send you the consultant list with your link to the full application. So you'll have that list. Start making phone calls, get consultants to talk to you about your project. Make sure that they understand that you're applying for a Preserve New York grant. If they're a consultant off our list, they're familiar with that process, and that's a plus. Choose a beautiful day and get out and start taking photos of your building. Make sure that you take at least 5. We require between 5 and 10 photos for Preserve New York. So make sure that we gain a pretty full understanding of your building and its needs through the photographs that you take. Be sure and preview that application. As I mentioned, you can print it out too if you want to and read it carefully. Compile your attachments. So there are a number of attachments that are required as part of the application. Make sure you get them all together ahead of time so it makes it really easy for you when you apply. And submit everything by the deadline. Yeah, I can go over those, those steps in more detail. I'm always available for questions too. Speaking of which, I should probably address the ones that are on my screen right now. So we have a couple questions. Can you use historic structure reports for National Register nominations? Yeah, yes, you can. That's a great question. So PNY does not have grants that help with the expense for nominations except for districts. That's correct. So, as I unfortunately had to explain to Nina, I hate saying no about this, but we don't fund nominations for individual buildings. Part of that's, I don't know, it's complicated, but we only fund nominations for districts because they fall under the umbrella of a cultural resource survey. But if you get a historic structure report, that can really go a long way toward helping you put together your National Register nomination. So that's a great question, and it's a great use for a historic structure report. It's a little bit overkill for what you need. So if your only goal is a National Register nomination for your building, a historic structure report's a little bit, they're expensive. They're expensive and they're comprehensive from a conditions report standpoint. If you only need the historic research part of it, that would not be a historic structure report. So a historic structure report includes the conditions assessment. If you want to list your building on the National Register and repair it and rehabilitate it or restore it, then yes, the historic structure report is for you. It's a great question. All right, so have you seen projects where modern day neighboring homes were raised to create a historic property's footprint? I think I see what you're saying. So you have this historic building and it's got modern buildings built around it on what used to be part of that historic property. I don't think that I've seen any specific examples of that myself. Doesn't mean they don't exist. I've seen modern-ish buildings torn down to build bigger modern buildings. That's never a good thing. Yeah, it's not something, well, we don't fund demolitions anyway, so I can't say that we wouldn't fundraising modern buildings to create a historic properties footprint. I'm not sure. I don't know. Anyway, I have not seen examples of that myself. So will we receive the slides from the presentation? Sure. So I'll send a follow-up email to you all within a couple of days after this webinar, and I'll include my slides. Good question, Nina. Thank you. All right. So, okay. So the process of applying the guidelines, it's super important that you read the guidelines. I can tell if people have not read the guidelines, so please don't be that person. Read the guidelines. If you still have questions after reading the guidelines, call me up. I won't be mad at you. I understand that they're not entirely clear in every foreseeable aspect, but please read the guidelines first. They go a long way toward helping you understand your eligibility, toward helping you understand our evaluation criteria and the process by which we evaluate these applications so that you know what we want to hear. Basically, you know what to include in your application. Our guidelines include the definitions of historic structure report, condition report, cultural landscape survey, and cultural resource survey. So those definitions are in there, as well as links to further reading about them. So if you're not familiar with a historic structure report, you want to know all about it, see our guidelines, it will tell you. There's also information about our funding priorities. I mentioned that because we're a regrantor of the New York State Council on the Arts, the object here is to increase public access to the arts through historic preservation. So keep that in the back of your mind when you're applying, speak to that. Our guidelines also point out your responsibilities as a grantee. What do you need to do to administer this grant? How do you close it out? Things like that. It's all in the guidelines. And finally, deadlines are in there as well, in case you forget. All right, so our pre-application is available on our website. Our guidelines are there as well. So here is the URL. The pre-application establishes your eligibility, introduces me to your historic resource so I understand what building that you have, summarizes your project, and in return you get the consultant list and a link to the full application. If I don't understand your pre-application or if it's not eligible, I will let you know. If we need to have a telephone discussion, we will. I'm always happy to discuss your projects with you. All right, so talk to your consultant early. I mentioned they get busy. And you want to get on their radar screen nice and early. If they're not appropriate for your project, they will usually tell you so. But you can also tell. You know, make sure that you understand what you want out of this preservation planning study and that they can provide, you know, make sure that they're giving you clear answers to your questions. Make sure they have the right kind of experience. So if they're not on our consultant list, when you apply, I'm going to want to see their portfolio, because we've had applications where the consultant had zero historic preservation experience. Bad news. So when we evaluate your application and we're evaluating how good your project is, we want to make sure that your consultant is an appropriate consultant for your project. So we'll be looking at that. All right, make sure you provide them with our grant guidelines so that they understand what to expect from the grant process in case they're not familiar with it. And then you will need to obtain a few things from your consultant in order to apply. The scope of work. So what do they intend to do? Their resume, we need to see their resumes, even if they're on our list, even if we know them really well and are really familiar with their work, send the resumes, because our review panel, I'm not on the review panel. I don't get to vote. All right, so I'm here to make sure that you're putting your best foot forward in your application and making sure that my review panel understands your project. So I'm the go-between. Make sure that you supply the required documents. If your consultant says, no, I've done 100 Preservation League funded, they don't need my resume, that's crap. Yes, we do. So make sure you get it from them. And this is all in the application, so don't worry. It spells out what we need from you and from the consultant. So when you take your photos, choose a nice day. Imagine that I am visiting your site, which I might. We're hoping to start up site visits again. We used to do them pre-COVID, and I am dying to get out and visit your sites again. But nonetheless, when you take your photos, pretend I'm visiting, make sure you're putting your best foot forward. Make sure that you're choosing good angles, good lighting. Make sure that I can see a clear view of your entire building. Don't chop off the roof in your photos. Please don't make your photos crooked. Do a good job. Take good photos. If you can't, just get somebody who can, get a young person with their iPhone, whatever it takes, get good photos. So take as many as you can. Prepare to submit at least 5 up to 10 photos. Start with an overall view. If it's a survey, make sure you get a nice long streetscape, and then get photos of buildings that you really want me to see, specific architectural styles, things like that. Narrow in on the areas of concern. So if this is a site-specific application, a condition report, narrow in on those areas of concern with your site. Make sure that we're seeing that. I know it's ugly. If something needs to be repaired, show it to us. We need to see that. I know you don't want to, but show it to us anyway. And then provide helpful captions. Tell us what we're looking at, what direction we're facing, include photo credits, who took the photos. Okay. Let's check for questions real quick. All right. If a municipality has to go to bid for a project, is it okay if they don't have a consultant on board? That is a fantastic question because we see it all the time. Municipalities are kind of a different thing. They need to put things out for bid. Sometimes they don't have a consultant by the time they need to apply for Preserve New York. That's fine. What we want from the municipality in that case is the RFP. So just provide us the request for proposals and we're good. We will want to know eventually what consultant you choose, but we understand if you don't have one ready by the time of application, just prepare to submit your RFP. Thank you for that question. That's great. Good questions. All right. Oh, there we go. Okay, so when you go to apply, you'll need to create an account in Smarter Select. Make sure you write down your login info so you don't forget. I could tell you horror stories, but we'll go over this in a little more detail in a moment. But create your account in Smarter Select if you've never applied through Smarter Select before. Preview the application, you'll get the chance to do that. In fact, aha. Okay, so when I send you the link to the full application, this is what you'll see. And you'll notice here that it says create new account. You'll need to click on that to create your account before you can log in. If you try to log in here and you've never logged in before, it won't let you. You can sign in with Google, or you can sign in by creating your account and having an email address and password associated with it. Take note of which one you decide to use and be consistent. If you sign in the first time with Google and then try to sign in this way, next time it won't work. Boy, I've got some panicked phone calls the day before applications are due from people saying, I can't sign in. And it's because they hadn't signed in for a while and they forgot how they did it. So make sure you take note of which method you use to sign in, write it down. If you're working collaboratively on an application, so, share your login information with whoever's working with you on it. Make sure they don't try to sign in another way. It just won't work. Okay. You will then be taken to this page that describes the Preserve New York Grant Program. At the bottom of the page, there's a little blue preview button. You can just barely see it. If you click on that, you can preview the whole application. You can go through the whole thing without having to fill out anything to go from page to page. You can print it if you like, share it with your board, share it with whoever. But that way you can see what's expected of you before you start. So when you're ready to apply, just hit the little green button that says apply. Make sure you save your work. So at the bottom of each page, there's like a save and continue. It's a little button. It's hard to see. Make sure you hit that so you're saving your work as you go. I don't want you to lose any of your work. All right, let's go back. Taking note of the needed uploads. When you preview the application, you'll see what's needed as far as uploads. I mentioned photos. You're going to need to upload photos. You're going to need to upload a board list. So a list of your board of directors, their names, their contact info, their affiliations. Make sure we know who these people are. We can't tell if there is a conflict of interest unless we know who your board members are. So make sure you include affiliations in that, please. Take all these uploads that you're going to need and just stick them in a folder on your desktop. That just allows you to get a lot of that work done ahead of time. So when it comes time to apply, you can just upload everything and go. You can work on your application a little at a time. You don't have to complete it all at once. You can save it, log out, go back, work on it later, that sort of thing. So don't worry, you can work on it over time. If you don't understand something, just call me. I'm happy to help. I know that online applications aren't everyone's cup of tea. We used to have a fillable PDF. You could fill it out pen if you wanted, mail it in. We used to do that. No longer. So if you're not sure, just give me a call. I'd be happy to walk you through any of this. No judgment at all. I had to learn all this. Anyway, it's not that hard, but I am very happy to walk you through it. Okay, so when it comes to your narratives, there are two narratives in the application. One is the narrative about your organization and its programs. We want to know what you do, how many people show up, whether it's online, in person, how have you handled COVID, how have things changed. We want to know about your organization and what you do. We want to be excited about you. We want to fund your project if we think we should fund it. So, put your best foot forward. Tell us about yourselves, what you do, why this building is important, why this project is important. You write good narratives, make sure that you look at the guidelines for the 3 criteria for evaluation. We evaluate these applications by historic preservation and project quality, the fiscal and managerial competence of the applicant, and the service to the public. Those are our 3 evaluations. They are equally weighted. We have a scoring system of 1 to 5. So that is how your application is going to be evaluated. So make sure you're addressing all 3 criteria in your summary narrative. So there's a organizational narrative and there's a project narrative. In that project narrative, tell us why your project meets those 3 criteria. Okay. Describe your programs. Like I said, I want us to be excited about your organization, what you do. When you describe your project, tell us how you'll use the funds. I realize you'll use your funds to pay your consultant because that's all you can use the funds for. But make sure that you understand what the consultant's going to do and include your match. We want to know, you've got that 20% cash match, you've got skin in the game, you're ready to move forward. Is your consultant more qualified? I've addressed that before. Make sure you understand what you're hoping to get out of this. The last thing we want is to fund a Preserve New York grant for you that will get you this historic structure report that will then go onto a shelf and never see the light of day again. We don't want that. Tell us what you plan to do with it. So we get this historic structure report that'll allow us to start fundraising for the recommendations in the report, whatever they may be. We're ready, get us excited about your project. Make sure that we understand your long-term plans for your building. We don't need to know every detail about your capital project at all, but we want to know your hopes and dreams for your building. How is this report going to contribute to your highest and best use for your building? So get us excited about the building. We want to fund it. All right, so we're going to ask you for 2 budgets. One is your organizational budget. It's a simple statement of your income and expenses. You need to demonstrate both. Show us your 20% cash match in there. Where is it coming from? Is it from donations? Is it from your operating budget? Is it, we just want to know where it's coming from. We want to see that you have that 20% cash match on hand or pledged or well planned for. Oh, Elizabeth, I see your Q&A. Thank you. Okay, sorry. I'm sorry about the chat. I don't know what happened. But yes, if you want credits, put it in the Q&A. Thank you. Okay, so show where your match is coming from in that budget. Municipalities, I don't want any 52-page municipal budgets, please. Just send me a 1-page summary of the income and expenses for that department that's in charge of overseeing the grant application. Okay, so whether it's your planning department, parks department, historic, historian, your line item for your historian, whatever it is, we just want to see where it's coming from. All right, the second budget we'll ask for is your project budget. Now this one should be simple, but I'm going to make it clear. that we don't want to see, our consultant will do this for $5,000 period. We don't want any lump sum budgets. Even if your consultant, bless his heart, shows up and says, oh, no problem, I'll do it for 10 grand. That's great. We want to see a breakdown though of expenses. So is the consent, he's going to come out for a site visit at least. So we want to see that site visit on there. What's it going to cost? Travel expenses for your consultant. Are they going to have a junior associate in their firm work on part of the report? We need to see that in there. What is their hourly rate? Hourly rates are important. We want to see why they're charging what they're charging. We want to make sure you are getting a good deal and that we are interested in, helping fund it. So there should be a clear breakdown in that project budget of tasks, deliverables, and totals. All right. Include your 20% cash match in that budget. We want to see it in there. Your tag request, obviously, and that should equal their expenses. Your match and tag request should equal their budget. So don't include any capital expenses in here. We don't even want to know what this is all going to cost. I'm sorry. I mean, it could be a lot, but we don't want to know. We don't need to know for this purpose. Okay. Well, I've probably gone over time. No, we have 2 minutes left for questions. So if you have any more questions, please type them in the Q&A. If you think of something later, give me a call. I'm always happy to hear from you. I love talking about projects with people and helping you with your Preserve New York application. I do have a number of drop-in sessions coming up over the next few weeks, right up until the deadline of March 31st. So if you think of something later or you want help with your application, feel free to sign up for one of those drop-in sessions via Zoom. They're a lot of fun. We learn a lot from each other. They're small groups, and it allows you to get one-on-one help with your application. You can always email grants. You can also email me directly, jrudler@preservenys.org. I believe we have a question. Let me see. Is there a budget form we need to use? No, we don't actually have a budget form. You can create it in Excel, and I think that we require PDFs for our uploads. So yeah, if you can upload it in PDF form, created from, no, we don't have our own form. I know some grant applications do, we do not. But if you need help with your budget, ask me. I can tell you just what needs to be in there. I will provide these slides in a follow-up email in the next couple of days, so you'll have all this to refer to. Our deadline is Friday, March 31st at 5 p.m. I don't want anybody staying late on a Friday night working on this application or working on it through the weekend. So by all means, get it in on time and then go out and celebrate. Pre-applications are only accepted until Friday, March 24th. So you need to get your pre-applications in. The sooner the better so that you can get your application in hand. We will not honor any pre-applications in that last week because that's just crazy. All right, any other questions? Can you spell your name? Yes, actually, let me put it in the chat and just tell me if you can see it. And I'll put my email address in here too. And all right, please let me know if you can't see this. My name and my email address are now in the chat. Hopefully you can see it. All right. Any other questions before we wrap this up? This has been fun. I love talking about our grants. I'm extremely proud of our programs. Please keep in touch with the League. There's a number of ways to do so. We do interesting work, if I do say so myself, and we have lots of great content on our website and on social media. We have a great social media communications person. She gets around to all the sites and tells all the cool stories. So please follow us. You can always make a donation if you'd like. We are a nonprofit. We rely on your donations for success in our work. So thank you very much if you are a League member already. You can see this webinar later on YouTube. I will send you all a link to it because it was recorded. All right. Thank you very much for joining me. I think it's time to go. I look forward to seeing all your applications. Let me know if you have questions. All right. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.